But it's now time to move on to the first panel, when we're going to be talking about the issue of regulation and the relationship between regulation and ethics and how one can and should inform the other. And so I'd like to inform our panelists up to the podium. We have John Edwards, who's the UK Information Commissioner, Professor Luciana Floridi, Professor of Philosophy and Ethics and Information at University of Oxford, Carly Kind, who's Director of the Ada Lovelace Institute, and Chris Anganostopoulos, who is Senior Principal Data Scientist from Quantum Black AI by McKinsey. Thank you very much. Slightly odd arrangement we've got here, but let's try and get going. So, as described, the topic that we really wanted to get into here is the question really about regulation, because as we're now seeing around the world, more and more governments and jurisdictions are moving to the point of regulating around issues, many of which we've been describing as kind of ethical issues and ethical concerns for some time. So we're quite interested to kind of explore this relationship between regulation and ethics, how one informs the other, and sort of raise the question actually, what next in terms of the ethical debate when governments and jurisdictions are in fact starting to regulate themselves. So what I want to do is get some individual views from the panelists. We'll then go into a bit of a discussion and then open up Q&A both with the room but also with colleagues who are watching online today. There should be a button on the right-hand side, I think, of if anybody's watching online, you can just submit a question there, and then it will feed through to colleagues in the room. But to kick off, I'd really like to go to John, first of all, just to get your initial perspectives.
Sure, thank you. And thanks to Tech UK for this opportunity, to my colleagues on the panel. I want to say something a little bit controversial, and I'm going to throw out a challenge to Luciano, because, I'm a lawyer and now a regulator. I've always thought that when you start having a conversation about ethics in an area, that assumes a lacuna of regulation. Because what you're saying is, regulation goes this far and stops. What do we do about this? Well, if regulation isn't going to tell us, then this must be the domain of ethics. And I think that shows, if that assumption is correct, and it probably isn't, but this is my working assumption, that a lack of imagination or a lack of understanding about the nature of regulation in this area in the UK, and in fact in many kind of OECD Western liberal democracies. What we have is a set of technology-neutral, principle-based regulatory settings which have stood the test of time for, UK GDPR is only 2018, but the underlying principles reach back way into the 90s. And they've been there as we've seen the internet develop. Haven't been 100% success there, but I don't know whether that's because of a lacuna or an ethical gap. But there is much in the existing regulatory framework that is capable of addressing what we might frame as ethical challenges in the world. You might say, is it ethical, for example, for an online platform to exploit the child users who are unable to express informed opinions and make sensible decisions about what's in their best interests? The answer ethically is clearly no. The answer legally, under our age-appropriate design code, also is no. So we've got a regulatory alignment with the ethical expectation. You might say, is it ethical for an innovative biometric application to sense emotions in subjects and to screen out, for example, job applicants or to select people for attention of law enforcement or customs based on those readings? And ethically, you might say, well, I have some discomfort with that. Legally, we say that is junk science. And if it is junk science, if it doesn't work, if it doesn't accommodate ethnic, neurodiverse kind of societal differences, then it cannot pass the tests in law of proportionality, of fairness, of data minimization. Because if there's an intrusive application that simply doesn't work, you don't get to the data minimization baseline threshold. So those are just a couple of examples, I think, to show how we have an elastic regulatory framework that is capable of addressing many of the challenges which I think are presented to us as posing unique ethical conundrums.
So quite an optimistic take there in terms of the capability of regulation to deal with a lot of these questions. Luciano, I'm going to come to you at the end when you've had a chance to listen to what other panellists have had to say. Carly, I suspect you're slightly more sceptical on that issue, but
yes.
Give me your take.
Well, sceptical might be a strong word. I mean, like John, I'm a lawyer, and I'm also a data protection lawyer, so I appreciate the ability of data protection lawyers to say that data protection covers most things in existence. But I have to say that it is the experience of most people who we talk to that there is not enough regulation, that they don't feel well enough protected. Now, it may be that on the books it exists, and there are a range of structural factors for why, including the funding of the ICO, for why those on-the-books regulations might not be properly adhered to, complied to, or enforced. But it is the experience of most people that their relationship with technology is an extractive one, which takes away their agency and doesn't leave them feeling empowered. And public research shows again and again that people would like to see more regulation, even if it comes at the cost of innovation and more products. And that is a problem that is worsening over time, not improving, despite the years passing since GDPR has been adopted. And I'm not advocating for getting rid of GDPR, but all I'm saying is we have to accept that there may be place for additional layers of regulatory protections for individuals, if for any reason, but to make them feel like they have more confidence and trust in these technologies, or that there's a trustworthy system out there. The Ada Lovelace Institute does a lot of work engaging with people both at kind of attitudes level, but also in a deeper, more deliberative way. And this is what we hear time and time again, the desire for more independent oversight, more regulation, more clarity about what's happening with their data and with these types of systems. So I think we do need new regulation, and we're now seeing that happen in a variety of different fora. And I think the last time we met in person 4 years ago, most of us would have been shocked to think that by 2022, so many types of regulation would be on the table. To the original question about whether or not ethics is now being left behind in favour of regulation, Luciano can correct me because I'm not an ethicist, but I think ethics is a fundamental foundation of any regulation. Ethics tells us what we value. And from that perspective, I'm not sure we've got the right approach on regulation yet, or at least some of the regulatory offers on the table suggest problematic ethics or a lack of thinking about ethics that might inform how we regulate. And that would be what I'd like to talk about today. What are the ethics behind the regulation that's on the table in the EU, and what we know at early stage about what's on the table here in the UK? And are they the right ethics, or are we thinking about how enshrining them in the right way?
Great, and I'm sure we will come to that in the next few minutes. But Chris, from a private sector sort of data scientist perspective, how do you feel we're getting that balance right between, or are we getting that balance right? What does it feel like from a practitioner's perspective?
Sure. So first, let me clarify that I'm not a lawyer or an ethicist. I'm privileged to be in the company of both lawyers and ethicists today, though. So I've been in the tech industry for all of my career, and I've built AI systems. I've done research in AI systems. I've led teams that build such systems, and also we consult at Quantum Black McKinsey clients in their AI strategy. So I have a perspective of the private sector, to your point. I'm also an honorary associate professor at Imperial, where I teach ethical AI. So I also have the perspective of trying to teach from a technical perspective our new cohorts of data scientists how to approach this matter. And I think if I take a step back for a moment, I think what is different in AI systems when we compare them to previous technological adoptions, big adoption events in history, is that the numbers tell us that we seem to be starting from a place of trust from the consumer. notwithstanding their desire for more regulation, our recent survey on digital trust suggests that up to 70% of consumers actually trust the way that the businesses that they engage with in the digital domain deal with their data. Up to 72% think transparency is of utmost importance. So they do have that value embedded in their judgment call. And up to 46% would consider switching to a different provider if informed that there is lack of transparency or lack of good policies. So we have a consumer base which is both aware of the risk, but simultaneously shows to be trustful of the main handlers of their data right now. Now, this is probably in part explained because the usage is dominated by what we call digital leaders, so companies that are actually positioning themselves as frontrunners in sort of thinking and thought leadership about AI. And we do see by surveying those individuals and those leaders that they do things differently, and that having solid governance on AI risk actually correlates with growth. So it's up to 1.6 times more likely that a company that has implemented AI policy will experience more than 10% growth at the moment. So this sets a picture where the risk is very high, actually, because you have a trusting consumer base and you have opportunity for growth by reassuring the consumer base that you are on top of your AI risk. But when we double click on actual events, we see a slightly different picture. So of those same leaders, up to 56% of them experienced a breach in the last 3 years. But only 10% of the consumers report having switched to a different provider because of a breach. So the information about actual failures to comply with AI ethics doesn't necessarily reach the consumer. Either they're not informed or they don't know how to follow up. Again, when we double click into consumer behavior, we see that although transparency is a core issue and they believe and want to make sure that their data handlers are abiding to AI ethics, when we look at the behaviors that the consumers actually go into in order to assure that, we see a very, very sharply decreasing funnel. So many will check the terms and conditions. Not many will follow up to see, for example, if their data were deleted after switching to a different provider. So the general picture that I'm trying to paint is one of there's an existing bedrock of consumer trust, which is, however, actually fragile because it's not tied to specific ways of operationalizing that trust, neither on the side of the industry, so that it's unclear exactly what to do to comply with AI ethics at the moment, neither on the side of the consumer. The consumer wants to make sure that their data is safe, but if you dig down deeper from that blanket statement, they don't know exactly what they're meant to do to assure that. Who do they reach out to make sure that the product they're using is safe? To your point about to the point about certification that we heard also earlier. So for us, the challenge is one of operationalizing what is a clear momentum which has been built through the contributions of academia and thought leadership and also institutions like Tech UK and Ada Lovelace. But now is the time to think about specific smart goals, and by smart I mean sort of, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bounded. Because unless you can time box and precisely specify what it takes on the technologist side to implement AI policy and on the consumer side to check that the product you're using complies, then these goals stay very vague and they're not actually executed upon. They stay at the level of principles. So that's the challenge that we are sort of facing, how to operationalize those principles. There's a few other points that we can get into later on, but that's sort of the opening perspective.
Brilliant, thank you. So we've talked about ethics, talked about regulation, and we've really sort of honed in on actions and outcomes and the extent to which they support trust and build trust or don't. Luciano, from your perspective, how do you see the world of digital ethics at a time when both existing regulators are asserting existing law and existing regulation in new areas, but also the legislators are pushing forward to try and regulate for new things?
Well, I'll start with some good news, which is I agree that if, that's important, if ethics is interpreted as something that needs to fill the gap when regulation is not there. Well, the good news is that ethics doesn't have to be there anymore, because we have, as you know, in several corners, and it's coming, good regulation. The bad news is that that picture is fictional. I mean, it's a mistake. No one should believe that. That's not what ethics is for. Digital ethics is what comes before, during, and after regulation. Before, as we heard, is what enables you to devise good regulation. On what grounds do we devise all this? We design all these rules. If not on ethical principles, the kind of society we want to live in, the sort of fundamental human rights and human dignity, etc. That is all ethical. During, I wish regulations were like chess rules, but they are not. You need to interpret a lot of that. And when something goes wrong, it's hardly ever so clear-cut, John, isn't it? You go to the judge, you go to the, authority, someone has to exercise ethical evaluation and interpret the law to say, yeah, that was right, but, or no, that was wrong, however, not so wrong, etc. So there's a lot of ethical judgment that goes on in interpreting the law. And afterwards, because how are we going to change the rules once they are no longer the right rules, if not through ethical analysis, understanding what society we want to live in, what kind of human beings we want to have in the future, etc. But that's not the only bad news for anyone who thinks digital ethics, job done, goodbye. We have regulations. Regulations, since it's a painful story, so World Cup. It's an Italian speaking, so let's not even go there. But rules of the game. Everyone says, what else do you need if not the rules of the game? Well, if rules of the game were everything you needed to qualify for the World Cup, Italy would be there, playing according to the rules. But companies that play according to the rules are not yet there. They are just not being excluded by society in terms of what is wrong. But it doesn't mean they are successful players. They've just done the minimum compliance required not to be excluded. Now, this is fundamental, and I know that we use too many double negatives in English, but the not to be excluded, that's what the law does. It tells you that if you don't abide, if you don't comply with these requirements, you're going to get out of that particular, say, business. That you comply doesn't mean nothing in terms of being a good player. So the strategy to be a good player as a company in a world so complex is, one, follow the rules. Play according to the rules of the game. Two, don't believe for a moment that that is sufficient. That is necessary. Now, confusing necessary with sufficient, that would be a logical mistake of a first-year undergrad, okay? So, insufficient, totally insufficient. That's how we see, for example, companies paying so much attention to reputation, public relations, outlook, customers' goodwill, technically speaking. Now, am I doing the right thing over and above what the regulations require? Of course, I don't want to be getting a ticket, a penalty or something because I didn't follow the rules. But following the rules, by all means, it would be hugely insufficient in that sense. So, before, during, and after, but apart from that, also, and that's the last point, being a good player. Now, being a good player also means sometimes doing something against the law. Because all this debate here, and we are in the right place, but we should not forget that we're talking about compliance in a country that has good regulation, but there's plenty of bad regulations out there. Now, start talking about, oh, I'm just compliant, to an international company that is doing the worst possible things in a corner, no one to be mentioned here, in a corner of the world that has regulations, and say, well, regulations, I'm there, I just follow the rules. No, you should not. Why? Ethically speaking, you should not follow the law because the law is wrong. Or vice versa, and this applies to our country, unfortunately. Someone remembers some scandals in the past, politicians, etc. I was following the rules. I was compliant. I know, but it was still ethically wrong to pay for that dog's house. back down to some memories. So compliance sometimes means having to get the guts of saying, I'm sorry, I can't do this. The rules are wrong, or vice versa. Yes, I can do this, but I won't do it because ethically speaking, the regulation, although it enables me, allows me to do it, it won't be the right thing to do for other reasons. So before, after, and during in terms of interpretation, being a good player, that's necessary versus sufficient. Don't get confused. And sometimes the law is wrong, don't follow it. Sometimes the law is there, but don't apply, because ethically speaking, it's not a good idea. So, back to the point. John, you're wrong.
Thanks, Lucia. I think that very usefully brought us back to the point that Carly, I think you wanted to explore a little bit more, which is this question of, because Luciano sort of saying, look, the law will never be enough. But I think you were suggesting, but the law can be a lot more or better than it is today. Do you want to kind of unpack that for us?
Perhaps it's useful to look at some of the specifics of proposals that are on the table. So I think I agree with Luciano. The way I've been thinking about it is there are ethics which inform the content of the regulation, and then there are also ethics which inform the process that the regulation requires for compliance. So if we look at the EU proposal, the content of the regulation is very much risk-based, much like the GDPR. And the risk that is the risk that is of concern is risk to fundamental rights, which are very much framed as individual rights. So that tells us about the ethics of the EU AI regulation, that it's about how we protect individual rights from harm. What I think is missing there is a consideration of societal risk and kind of group and collective harm. How are we thinking about protecting democratic values, for example, which might cut across individual rights? And the process that's on the table at the EU level is a very much a kind of self-certification, compliance with risk assessment and mitigation. It's from our perspective perhaps slightly less intensive or less onerous on companies. It doesn't require a third party to certify compliance with the regulation at this stage. So I think that tells us also about the ethics of what is underpinning the regulation. If we could contrast that with a different type of regulation, which might, for example, have a bigger role for public participation in the impact assessment phase, and that's what the US has proposed in the blueprint for Bill of Rights, a more public participatory way of thinking about risk, assessing it, mitigating it. So that tells us about the ethics of that proposal on the table, which is that AI requires public consent and trust and involvement in thinking about risk. If we look at the UK proposal, kind of nascent as it is, and I don't want to critique it because it's very much a kind of policy statement rather than a white paper at this stage, but it's from our perspective perhaps much more baseline in terms of what the ethics that are apparent there. It says essentially AI should be safe and it should work like it says on the tin. It doesn't say a lot more than that. It doesn't tell us what would AI, a good society, look like with AI in it, for example. It doesn't, include some of the OECD principles around AI, for example, inclusive growth or democratic values. It doesn't mention human rights. So those, from my perspective, some of those ethical issues are missing from the current proposal. And again, caveated with it's a draft at this stage, so I'm hoping there's room for movement and change. But that would be some of the critiques I'd have of current proposals as they are.
Thank you. Chris, can I come back to this, so this question around kind of public participation then? Because you talked a little bit about this gap between business behaviour and the kind of consumer or citizen perception of that behaviour. And so, I mean, if you had a more sort of participatory approach to things, would that solve that problem? Would Carly's proposal of just getting more engagement, lifting the lid a little bit more, would it address the kind of issues that you've got?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one perspective that I find useful in thinking about this is contrasting it with how we approach the question of regulation in the pharmaceutical industry, for example, and in general in the life sciences. And it's fair to say that most of us are engaged in a large-scale social experiment right now, like in the way that our data is being used in social media, for example. In that there's no precise definition of a product, right? So it's not like an AI system was built and versioned and tagged in November 2010, and we're using that since then. It's evolving. It's experimenting in ways that we don't have access to. So it's a bit like we've given broad consent for our data to be used for any purpose whatsoever in terms of experimentation. A bit like a biobank, but for personal data, where you give kind of broad consent. But the difference is that in the case of a biobank, there is an ethical consent process that pushes the user, the provider of data, to think about it really carefully and say, do I really want to give broad consent so that researchers around the world can use my data? And are these researchers themselves abiding by ethical conduct? So there is a question of transparency. There's a question of telling the consumer what you're doing, but I doubt that it will be possible to give complete transparency because of the complexity of the systems and the fact that the end user will be unlikely to be able to understand all the details. So therefore, that relationship has to be mediated somehow. And that is, I think, where there is a role for processes and specific regulation, or even some kind of expert mediation to help users have a third-party objective opinion, or some kind of maybe body, like, for example, I belong in the Royal Statistical Society as a chartered statistician. I'm obliged to speak truth about data, right? Like, with that, whatever that definition means. But having that kind of certification at the professional level, right, would also be an interesting angle to explore, like an AI responsible AI certification that is governed at the level of the professional, so that it's not just a case of I trust the brand of the company. It's not just a case of I actually read 35 pages of terms and conditions, because how often will you do that? But it's a question of I delegate part of the process of building trust to institutions that are sitting outside and around and inside this industry, but they're not necessarily a question of a certification that goes on the product itself. Because to just return to my initial point, it's going to be difficult to have a situation where AI products are a little bit like toasters, where, like, here's the version, it was certified 10 years ago, and that certification is still good. They evolve too fast, so it's more like a process that is more akin to being part of an experiment than being a user of a product often.
So, John, one of Chris's kind of fundamental institutions, therefore, must be the regulator. So, from a regulator's perspective, how do you view this issue of how are citizens and data subjects supposed to understand the complexity of not just the world today, but the kind of world that we can see 2 or 3 years ahead? Talk about some of the AI apps earlier in the session. But from your perspective, how do you address this complexity issue?
Well, I think that it's enormously problematic to have a model where you expect individuals to be making informed choices about really complex and opaque technologies. I mean, to use the pharmaceutical example, I don't read the pallet loads of data that are submitted to the regulatory authority before taking a medication which is approved by a doctor. I trust in the regulatory regime. And I think that what Chris has described with the high baseline level of confidence in innovative technologies which are released into the wild actually reflects an expectation that there is a regulatory system working, and that organisations like mine, the ICO, are there to patrol that and to guide that. I think that we as regulators have to be more innovative ourselves to be providing that assurance, whether it's by certification or codes of practice or guidance or otherwise. But we need to be more assertively in that space, and to be demonstrating that the laws which we administer are capable of addressing these challenges. And I think we do that. We have, for example, the sandbox, which allows organisations like Chris's to come in and to work alongside the regulator and data protection specialists to figure out what you're doing, what the implications are, whether there are any regulatory gaps. And I'm not in closed mind as to whether there are. I haven't seen any at the moment that we haven't been able to address. There's also, I think, an increasing need to recognise that these technologies cross regulatory boundaries, and it's increasingly difficult to segment industries and regulators according to the traditional models, which is why we've come together with my colleagues at Ofcom, at the FCA, at the CMA, to form the Digital Regulators Cooperation Forum, the DRCF. Now, what that does, besides providing a forum for us to share notes and things, is to identify cross-cutting features. And we've, for example, recognised that AI is something that touches on each one of our regulatory mandates. And we have to find and present to innovators and industry what our joint expectations are. And so we've produced, for example, work on AI auditing, which I think is enormously important in sending a signal that if there are regulatory gaps, those are going to take a long time to fill. How do we make the best of what's there in order to give confidence to both innovators and consumers that there is a functioning regulatory system that is taking a precautionary approach and a harm-based approach, risk-based approach to some of these innovations?
I'm glad you mentioned the DRCF. I mean, in a way, sort of Ofcom and the CMA are very much kind of traditional economic regulators. They have a kind of very, very kind of clear remit and has sort of a sort of rule book in terms of their role. Have they? Do questions about ethics come naturally to those regulators? And what's your experience been in having these more kind of these more ethical discussions rather than just kind of actually, what do we need to do to implement this piece of regulation?
I mean, I bow to and accept the admonition of my colleague Luciano in that it's wrong to frame a conversation about ethics being founded on an assumption of an absence of regulation. And it's absolutely true to say that good regulation has a solid ethical foundation. And I think that is how my colleagues approach their regulatory mandate, that these laws have not just appeared on stone tablets from the mountain, that they are developed in a process of discussion and consultation which reflect the ethical values of society at the time they were promulgated. Now, I think the question that Luciano puts is really important, that we must continually question and challenge the fitness for those in a changing environment. And that's what I think I see my colleagues at CMA, at Ofcom, at FCA doing when we come together at the DRCF to see whether our laws are fit for purpose, whether they can be made fit for purpose, whether working closely together can improve their application in a modern digital economy.
I want to come to the question of foresight, and because obviously technology is moving incredibly quickly, it almost feels exponential at an almost exponential pace, and I want to go on to this question of the extent to which we can have foresight in terms of what the big issues are likely to be. But before that, I can't resist asking Luciano a sort of what strikes me as quite a philosophical question, but it's one that Carly raised, which is so Carly talked about having greater ambition for our regulation and our ethics in terms of thinking about what it would mean to have a good society and to live in a good society. But Luciano, is that do we fare well when we have those discussions about what a good society is? Is that something that we can do with confidence, or does it? There've been plenty of fairly sort of desperately awful attempts at defining and setting out kind of so-called good societies.
First of all, we should do it with zero confidence. It's confidence that makes the worst mistakes, that you know better, you know what you're doing, and that's the society you want. First half of the past century has seen plenty of horrors in terms of Germany, Italy, Russia, Spain, everywhere. We know the recipe for the perfect society, and we're just going to do anything that takes to get there. The horrors that humanity has managed to generate. So zero confidence. Now, as John said, keep questioning, keep adjusting. You need to have, however, some kind of regulative ideal of where you want to go. So a bit more like a direction of travel, so to speak. And picking up what quite rightly I think Carly was saying is, for example, in terms of a good society here and the regulation on AI, yes, the AI Act seems to be hugely concentrated on individual rights. seems to be missing quite a lot to the societal aspects. That is crucial. But another big miss, and if you read that through, it's extraordinary. There's almost nothing about the environment. Now, that is like a big ethical issue. Like, do we really want to have a risk-based regulation that is going to frame one of the most powerful technology ever generated by humanity, entirely focus only on individual rights, missing the societal aspects, and completely ignoring the environment in the 21st century, while we are on a planet that is boiling itself to death? Insane. However, that shows a blind spot. I don't mean to say that our colleagues in Brussels are anti-environmental, if anything, but clearly that ethical aspect was missing. So back probably to the next moment in our conversation, a bit of foresight, a bit of ability to say...
That's not a huge amount of foresight, to be honest.
A tiny bit. So where do we want to go as a society? Don't have the confidence that you have the blueprint, multi-stake, many voices, a variety of tolerant aspects. So by all means, keep the doors open, but have a sense that, that direction is the right direction as opposed to the other direction. That should be the minimum. And start being more inclusive in terms of what you care about, not just the individual, but the society in which you live and the environment in which we all have to share our lives. Then we start talking about an answer to your question. Yes, it is possible to have regulation that helps a society to move in the right direction. That's good, solid, and allow me to say this, I guess we are on record, liberal democracy, Western style. And that's what we have contributed to the history of humanity, a decent way of moving forward together. It can be done, but we need to be totally careful, and as I said at the beginning, zero confidence.
Carly, does that satisfy, would that kind of approach satisfy your ambition for...
Yeah, I guess I have a question for Luciano, which is something we've been wrestling with or thinking about, which is, to what extent is part of this a question of political vision? Do you need to, there's a politics of AI regulation, and the EU have laid out their political theory behind regulation, which is very much fundamental rights. And I wonder, are there multiple competing ways you can think about this, just as there are multiple economic theories about what makes a good and vibrant economy? Do we need some kind of political theory of AI regulation to drive it? I'm not trying to assert that there's one truth that we can come to around a good society, but it feels like we need a political vision for what role AI plays in society, and there may be multiple competing political visions, but we're not really hearing many articulated, I suppose. There's, everything is very much what we don't want to see, but we're not seeing a positive vision put out on the table. Sorry, I didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I just wondered from your perspective.
No, I think you're completely right. Ultimately, and that is, I say this with huge regret, ultimately it does become a question of politics. I say it with regret because the kind of politics we see everywhere around ourselves, they're not particularly reassuring. So, shall we say politics capital P, if it is to be found somewhere in some of the capitals we know. To give a concrete example so that we're not too philosophical, not the right place, a long time ago when with the British Academy, the Royal Society, we had a whole long debate, if you remember, pre-COVID, it seems to be another century really, on fundamental principles for the management of data, etc. Well, it became clear that the UK had a human flourishing politics, and the EU a human dignity politics. And you start thinking, oh, there's a real hair splitting. It is not. Let me give you just one example. When it comes, for example, to past generation. Dead people don't flourish. They are there to be cherished, but there is nothing you can do in terms of a human flourishing base in terms of respect for dead people. Is that relevant? Yes, because people actually die and stay on Facebook. So regulation about digital remains on Facebook based on human flourishing, you don't quite get very far. Based on human dignity, well, it's a different story. And then you start thinking that human dignity based regulation, when it comes to digital remains on social media, could be compared, for example, to what we do to mummies in museums. We also use human dignity not to put, say, a Santa Claus costume on a mummy in a museum. That's you would find that wrong, because etc. etc. So, tiny little example of something that really starts small, but it's like going out of the harbor, and the little thing that at the beginning is just a little difference between I go here and you go there. Further and further down the road in terms of journey, you find yourself here and someone else there. So the answer to your question seems to me, I said, unfortunately, hugely political. And the last point, and I close here, is that the second half of the 20th century has seen mostly politics being run by economic sort of reasons, which is great. Not so much by ethical reason, because the first half was run by ethical reasons and it made a complete disaster. How we balance politics, capital P, based on economics and politics, capital P, based on ethics, so that we get the right society, well, that's why I said, unfortunately, it is a political issue, because we don't have the right people at the moment.
The reason I just wanted to point to that is because it just does seem that we're so much led by what's technically possible at the moment, rather than what's politically desirable or socially desirable. That would be just the only point that I wanted to add to that.
Thank you. I was so taken by that image of dressing up a mummy in a museum in a Santa Claus costume. I kind of slightly forgot what my next question was going to be. But it was, of course, about this kind of foresight issue, and there has been lots of chats about GPT. And indeed, Carly, you were quoted on the BBC website today, I think, in commenting on it. I don't know if you're aware. Very good comment, by the way. But you flagged up some of the risks. The potential to automate the production of malware and so on. So, Chris, I wanted to come to you really. What are the foreseeable advances in AI and digital technology that these guys should be worried about?
That's an interesting
You're going to reject
question.
the premise of that question.
Yes, yeah. So I think it's very difficult to try to predict the future when it comes to technology. I would actually argue that the principles that have been generally put into place, and I'm also looking to your recent paper, Luciano, relatively recent, where we you kind of looked at all the different frameworks for principles in AI, and you found common place. And effectively, we're talking about transparency, explainability, fairness, protecting autonomy. Effectively, there are basic principles that undercut, and I think along those dimensions, any AI product, even caricatured as an autonomous decision maker, you can already get a grip for the kind of risks that it entails. There are some exceptions to this, like when you have outliers, like a self-driving car, for example, which is completely autonomous in the near future in a way that no other system right now really is. Then, of course, you get into kind of actual moral dilemmas that might appear on the road, of course, like mini trolley problems, like what do you do? Do you swerve left or right? But again, I understand that the thinking around regulation, from what we know publicly, is focusing on those problems separately. So as you detect those emerging technologies from AI that have reached the level of maturity to completely disintermediate the human, then the problem becomes a bit domain specific. What exact domain are you making decisions in? And therefore, what extra protections do you need? And who is accountable? Who is liable? These are really difficult questions. How do you deal with insurance in those contexts and so on? So these are the emerging AI super products are going to be clear for a few years before they actually hit the public consumption. So I'm not so worried about that. Maybe if we reach the singularity, we need to start getting worried. But I don't think we're there yet. What I do want to raise, though, as an open problem to some extent, and I'm keen to hear everybody's view on this, is that if you take the perspective that what AI does differently is that it actually automates decision making to such an extent, because it's able to reproduce cognitive abilities of humans, that it's actually becoming responsible for moral decisions. And I think that's genuinely different. There's genuine trade-offs that AI practitioners and developers face every day that are inherent to the problem. So it's not a case of I want to be fair, but I'm not going to be because it costs more. It's nowhere near as simple as that. It's a question of how do I trade off privacy for fairness? How do I trade off one type of fairness, group fairness, for example, against individual fairness. And in those situations where there is a trade-off, the perspective of being compliant is not very helpful, because it's not a case of passing the bar. To your point, the bar is the minimum, but above that bar, there's a solution space where there are trade-offs that leaders need to make. And what we find is that it's very challenging to have these conversations. If you're in an organization and your data scientist tells the executive that, should we pay for 10% more data in order to improve our fairness by 2%? Should we compromise our risk of privacy leakage by 5% in order to gain an advantage in fairness of 6%? These are the conversations we do not know how to have. And where technology can help is to expose that Pareto front, to expose that frontier of solutions where the trade-offs are optimal. But then there needs to be a process as to how do we actually trade these things off with each other. And I think that's where the conversation is in many organizations right now.
I think that's really interesting because, in a way, a lot of the challenges that we've got today, we still have as government tries to legislate for online harms and online safety, are absolutely about those trade-offs, aren't they? And about actually how do companies make those trade-offs in different circumstances, and who should be the arbiter, and how does that work? So I think that's clearly one of the really challenging aspects. But I just wanted to come back to, so but in terms of kind of the foreseeable developments in AI, you're kind of saying that the kind of frameworks and principles that Luciano and colleagues have developed give us all the right tools and all the right questions to interrogate what the technologies that are foreseeable to you in terms of their ethics and so on.
That's right, and I think the only point I'm making to qualify that is that there is definitely a situation where a change in quantity introduces a qualitative change.
Yeah.
Right. So the difference between assisted driving and automated driving is a qualitative change, but technologically it's just version 12.2, version 12.1. So the one thing to be alert of is where there is true loss of autonomy or human in the loop. That, to me, is a signal that now needs to be looked at in a domain-specific perspective and understood, possibly in the context, to your point earlier, Chris, of existing regulation for that domain, or not. Like that's for the lawyers to decide. But that qualitative change of AI systems gaining sufficient autonomy that I could be giving this speech by using ChatGPT, right? Like, for example.
I almost did, yeah.
So that I think is where, yes, that now requires a more careful look. So it's a question of degree rather than a question of property. I think we've laid out the principles well enough.
I think it's interesting that you brought up self-driving vehicles, because if I think back to the first Digital Ethics Summit, I'm pretty sure we should have all arrived in those self-driving vehicles by now. So it's interesting that sometimes the pace of technology doesn't quite meet the hype. But Carly, are you confident that we have the ethical tools that we need to really scrutinise the technologies that are coming along? If for example, these large language models, do you think actually the fairly sort of straightforward set of questions that we remember the epic meetings where that we've kind of reduced down to, are they the right tools, or is there anything that you think is missing in that?
I don't think we've solved it
We haven't
yet.
even tried to use them, maybe.
I think, Chris touched on one big issue. I think for the last few years we have been treating AI as products, and now we're seeing AI as not a product, it's a service. Yeah. It's maybe even something more than a service, it's infrastructure. And I think that ChatGPT is a great example, foundational models, generative AI, we're seeing them, in only a few players will be able to develop them, although great to see some open source products emerging alongside corporate AI research teams developing kind of large language models. But they will become the basis on which many products and services are ultimately built. And so access to them and governance of them becomes a big infrastructural issue. And I don't think the current regulatory proposals are thinking well enough about that. And I don't think we have I don't think the ethical conversations we've been having are sophisticated enough to think about how we deal with some of these big kind of governance problems that are outside of context and individual usage. I actually think the kind of biotechnology analogy is a really useful one, and I think moving from the product analogy on AI, which is what the EU has done with really modelling AI regulation on product safety regulation, and thinking more about medical regulation or pharmaceuticals, where the product has to be considered in a dynamic context, a continually evolving and iterating context. I think that throws up new challenges. So I don't, I think we've come such a long way in instilling a culture of ethical thinking in technology practice. And Tech UK and partners have had a huge role to play in that. It is no longer the case that it is an anomaly to see ethical discussions happening in technology development, and that is wonderful. But I don't think we're anywhere close to the solutions on some of the big questions.
I was really struck, actually, just the last few days, just seeing quite a lot of journalists asking the right questions, which I think is really encouraging in terms of as a starting place for some of that public debate. So I think it's really positive. We've got 10 minutes left. And I do want great hands in the room. That's exactly what I wanted to see. Okay, lady at the back to start with, and then we'll work our way around the room.
Thank you. Christina Yanzhang from the Metaverse Institute. Elon Musk recently announced that his Neuralink company is planning to have human trials in about 6 months. And we all know that he planned to put the chips in the human brain to enable people with special needs, especially they are blind, can regain vision, and treating some of the most difficult, like brain disease like Alzheimer's. And he's even talking about using AI to enhance the brain power of human in the future. So my question to the panel is, how do we set up an effective regulatory framework to ensure people who can benefit from such controversial and frontier technology, they can benefit, but also during the process, the very sensitive information collected from the human brain will be responsible, safe, and ethical? Thank you.
I really love all these straightforward questions. See, I've been going really easy on the panel. Yeah. Wow. This is a huge issue. Obviously, if we have AI technology that can be beneficial in healthcare, why wouldn't we use it? But are we capable of using it safely? John, would you like?
Thank you. One thing that medical research has, I think, in most Western liberal democracies is an overarching framework of ethical oversight and approval. So that's one encouraging factor. The other, I think, the important issue that this confronts is the bringing together of regulatory regimes. And of course, we have medical devices very rigorously regulated with a precautionary principle in mind, and that should give us some comfort. But I do think it's important for ethicists and data protection regulators and human rights regulators to be there to make sure there is a seamless assessment of the technology. I think, the weird thing about information, innovation, data, digital, is that it's absent a precautionary principle. So having a medical device regime intercede, it puts it slams the brakes on to an extent and allows us to step into that space without the technology running ahead. So I think that's maybe not as scary as it could be, because we are able to use that slowdown time to actually do the thinking of what those emerging technologies mean for data protection and privacy and other areas of human dignity and autonomy.
Thank you.
I'd love to add a quick remark, if I may. So, just following up on that, what is the medical technology ecosystem? How do they approach these problems? They think about risk-benefit. To your point, for some individuals, it might be possible to already demonstrate now risk-benefit. Others, it might be further down the line. They think about recent guidance from the FDA, to give one example, on the use of AI within medical devices. For example, lays out specifically that the AI system has to be frozen at the time of deployment. So there's no longer this issue of evolving versions and experimentation. And if there is a need to retrain, there are specific triggers that you need to specify in advance and say that if I see my performance in my model behaving this or that way, then I need to retrain. So I think it is actually very interesting the moment that domains mix, we suddenly get a lot more clarity, precisely because we can leverage multiple frameworks rather than have to devise things from first principles. So I couldn't agree more with your statement.
So more difficult questions to come. I want to turn to our esteemed member from the House of Lords, who can...
Thanks, Anthony. A fascinating discussion, I must say. Thank you.
Tim Clement-Jones, House of Lords. A fascinating discussion this morning, I must say. But we had the Singaporean perspective earlier, and I wanted to, in a sense, bring the panel to the sort of international question, really. Clearly, AI crosses boundaries, not just sectors. How important do the panel think we've got common ethical standards, OECD and so on, at the international level? How important is it, and this is not a loaded question at all, how important is it that we have some sort of harmonization of standards, regulation, and so on going forward?
Great question. John, can I come to you again on that one? You talked about the cooperation between regulators within the UK, but the international perspective.
Yeah, I think it's enormously important, and I'm pleased, Tim, that you brought up the Singaporean presentation because, I think that was really interesting. I think the Verify AI product that the gentleman spoke of is a really innovative approach to kind of upstream regulation, and it's the kind of thing that we're looking at very closely. In terms of international standards, yes, I think that it's absolutely essential that we work together to try and have interoperable standards. It's the $64 trillion question, how we do that, and there are a number of competitors. I think that the OECD continues to be a really important forum for those discussions. Our colleague from Singapore mentioned the global CBPR, which is elevated from the APEC CBPR, which the participants are expressing great confidence in. As a certification process, it's yet to find an audience or a market. So, I mean, the global dimension to that is relatively new, so it'll be interesting to watch and monitor how that develops. Otherwise, there are forums such as the G7, which my office participates in at the regulator level. The Global Privacy Assembly releases materials on AI and joint positions. That's a useful forum. But I think increasingly we need to see greater state-to-state engagement on what are the minimum standards for interoperability, particularly in terms of data transfers. But I think that increasingly we'll see a case for an international community of states determining what are minimal ethical standards and the rejection of technologies that are developed without reference to those standards. And we see some of that occurring in different parts of the international economy. But I know that Carly will be participating with other third sector entities internationally which are participating in this global conversation.
I think crucially we're also going to have to think about what we do about bad actors as well. Yes. on the geopolitical stage as well. Luciano, did you want to come in?
Just a short comment, because I agree on the need for this international coordination, etc. At the moment, we have a lot of so-called Brussels effect, of course, in regulatory sort of aspects, especially GDPR data. One may expect a similar effect, perhaps, when it comes to AI. It's a bit of a shame. It would be preferable if we had a, shall we say, Brussels-London-Washington effect, or a transatlantic effect, which then would be unstoppable. If you think about it for a moment, if there is a Brussels effect so strong when it comes to data protection, imagine what would that be if it were a London-Brussels-Washington effect on the global economy in terms of AI and data protection as well. Now, if only we could move in that direction, if only the bill and the AI Act and the not yet white paper were to start getting some coordination, then we would see the economies of the world moving in that direction. Now, for once, the philosopher here is playing the economist. I think we need a bit of a traction in terms of economic input.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm afraid I've failed as a chairman, so we're now almost out of time. But I do just want to check whether there was a question, any questions online. Sana, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to ask.
I don't know if my mic is
Yep.
working. Okay, perfect. There's quite a few, but just in the interest of time, I'll just ask one. So, is the panel worried about the proposed cuts to EU regulations, particularly around uncertainty, ethical dimensions, human rights rules, and risks to data adequacy?
Okay, so I think that was a question really around the government's proposals to around how it deals with EU legislation, and are there risks that we could sort of throw the baby out of the bathwater as we sort of take this rather radical approach of addressing EU regulation. John, did you very quickly on that one?
Yeah, I think reading between the lines, it's a question about the Data Protection and Digital Information Bill, because just at the end there was a concern about how might this affect adequacy. So I suspect that it's that rather than the proposals in terms of AI and digital markets. In that respect, no, I'm not concerned. I know the government has consulted widely, and the legislation reflects three kind of planks of policy, first of which is ensuring the ongoing protection of data for people of the UK. That's absolutely important. The second being the maintenance of adequacy in the European Union, and I concur that that's a really important value, and I think a lot of people consulted in this room have made that feedback to DCMS and to government. And third, that where possible, consistent with those first two, any law reform should aim to reduce compliance costs for business, and I think that's something that is unobjectionable in a European sense as well. So I'm pretty confident that the UK is capable of expressing its own version of data protection, which does not imperil adequacy and which does not, in fact, reduce the level of protection for Europeans' data in the UK, which, after all, is what adequacy is all about.
I'm really sorry that we're going to have to draw this really fascinating session to a close. Time has gone incredibly quickly. But